Hey all, and welcome back to Fuzzy Ducksy Gaming, and a new video on the channel. It's going to be a quick one, just running through the one pet peeve and the one thing I see a lot of people making mistakes with on builds when they ask me for help and say, I've followed your POB, but I'm 10% short on damage, I'm 15% short on evasion and armor, and my gear looks identical to yours. And it all revolves around flasks. If you're comfortable with understanding exactly what suffixes you need on flasks and the effect it can have on your build, then there's probably not much in this video for you. However, if you're one of those people that just follows a build guide and then just throws a diamond flask on that you find in the campaign or a granite flask, then this video is probably going to be of a big help to you. So flasks are, I would say, the most important thing on any build bar build enabling uniques. And that is because the combination of suffixes you can get can give you way more increase in stats than any gear that you could put on, and probably 8 to 10 passive points on your skill tree. And as I say, the one thing I see people doing when they ask me to check builds is they do not have any flask set up the way that you should to maximize your build. So before we get into suffixes and what sort of difference they make, I'm just going to pop into game to talk about a few of the things around flasks that are super important that most people know and will do, but some people are just not aware of it. There's lots of things in the game that the game doesn't really tell you very well unless you really look into it. And there's so much that for a new or intermediate player, you just don't find where this information is because it's not easily available in the game. So the first thing to note on flasks is always quality them up with your glass blowers baubles. If you didn't know, you can go to any vendor after about Act 3, I think, and you can buy these with blacksmith's whetstones, and they're 8 or 9 each for the bauble. These drop in massive quantities from Arch Nemesis monsters now, so don't feel like you have to pick these up from the ground. Go to the vendor and buy them with your whetstones. And the reason you want to quality your flasks up is they add duration. So if we just look at this normal Quicksilver flask, it has a duration of 6%. If we go onto my qualityed up Quicksilver flask, it's 7.2%. So it's 20% increased duration on your flask. And that is super important, especially if you're using one of the flasks that use 40 out of 60 charges. You really want as much help as you can at trying to keep that flask up. The second thing is enchant your flask. It is a massive quality of life. So myself in particular, I'm not very good at keeping flasks up in terms of I spam flasks all the time. I'm really bad at it. And I might find that I'm using them when it's still got 4 or 5 seconds left, which when you're mapping is not too much of an issue, but it's not a good habit to get into. So to get myself out of it, I've actually just set all my flasks up to use automatically to try and break that habit to make it better on bossing so I'm not overusing my flasks. But more, I don't want to keep having to hit on my flasks and ruining my left hand. So I've got all of my flasks set up to use when charges are full. So all I need to do when I'm mapping is worry about hitting a life flask if I need a bit of life recovery, or if you're not corrupted blood immune, just hitting your flask to get rid of a bleeding effect. And all you do is you would go to your crafting bench. I think these unlock automatically. You don't have to uncover any of these recipes. And you've got tons of different ones that can be used for different purposes. So have a look over the crafting bench and see what you've got. So, for example, you've got here, if you are not ailment immune and you don't want to be frozen, you can craft use when you become frozen on one of your flasks that'll have, unfreeze and then you're immune to chill. There's loads of different things you can do to set up on your flask. But the two that most people use for mapping is the one I've got here, which is use when charges reach full. This can also be used, I just prefer to use when charges reach full. And some people like to use their flask manually, but maybe don't want to have to hit every button. So they will have one flask with no enchantment whatsoever, which would be, say, this left flask, for example. They would then put all their utility flasks here, and they would craft use when an adjacent flask is used. So when this one is used, this one procs because of the enchantment, that one will prop for the same reason, and so will that one. And you've got like a chain effect on your flasks. And that's a really nice one to use as well. I just prefer not to press any buttons at all. And for a mapping build, this is going to save you thousands and thousands and thousands of button presses, which your hand will thank you for in the long run. And then the last thing to look at before we go into the stats on flasks are Quicksilver flasks. Now, I use one because I want to get maximum speed. But on this character, I already have about 200% movement speed. So in all honesty, I could drop this for something else. It could be a unique flask. It could be a sulfur flask to get some damage. It could be a silver flask to get onslaught. Just check that your build needs a Quicksilver flask. Like for a lot of builds that don't have a lot of increased movement speed, mapping feels dreadful without them, so they are a mandatory part of the build. But for builds like a Raider, for example, that gets tons of movement from Frenzies, or maybe a Deadeye that's got Tailwind and possibly Onslaught, does a Quicksilver Flask make that much difference? There are, to me, builds that are too fast. Like, you cannot control what that build's doing. All you're basically doing is randomly hitting your attack button, hoping that you kill stuff. So the last thing I would say is check whether you actually need a Quicksilver Flask. I think for my build, it's borderline. I think I could swap this out for another flask because the build is quick enough as it is. The other thing to look at is what's your movement skill. So I use Whirling Blades, and Quicksilver Flask doesn't make any difference to this. It's all about attack speed. So I could use Whirling Blades to get between every pack. Then my Quicksilver Flask is fairly redundant. So I could look at re-rolling this flask into something different. So with those bits out the way, let's jump into the build, and I'll show you what I'm talking about when I'm going on about suffixes on flasks and how important they are, because I guarantee there is not one item you could put on your build unless it's build enabling that's going to make the same difference as suffixes on flasks. So we're just going to run through my flasks, and then I've put together a group of flasks which are the same flask, but they would maybe be ones that you picked up in the campaign, so they're lower level, and you've just ID'd them and stuck them on. So Quicksilver Flask, I've got increased crit because I'm not crit capped. The Jade Flask, I've got some increased evasion. The Granite Flask, increased armor. And then the Diamond Flask, I've got attack speed. And my overall stats with my buffs up are just shy of 12.5 million DPS. We've got 17.8k evasion, armor, and 24.8k evasion. So let's go into OneNote and we'll just note these down and then we'll see what difference it makes. So DPS is 12.45 million. Our evasion is 24.8k. And our armor is 17.8k. Now, I don't have all tier 1 suffixes, so my flask could be even better, but I've rolled fairly high on them and I'm happy with them. These can all be rolled with alterations, so don't feel like, oh, I can't roll them. You've probably sitting on 500, 600, 700 alterations and tons of augments. Just use them, get your flask better. So we'll go back in, and now we're going to put on these flasks. Now, I have gone to like worst case scenario that your flasks are not really giving you much benefit. So I've got Quicksilver with a bit of increased movement speed. Got a Jade Flask with increased cast speed. We have a Granite Flask with increased elemental resistances. And then we have a Diamond Flask with increased block and stun recovery. And then we'll go and have a look at what that's done to our DPS. So it's gone down to 11.18. So we'll make a note of that. Our evasion has gone to 21.8k. And our armor has gone to 11k. This is the difference from just rolling flask suffixes with your alterations. It makes a huge difference if you make sure that every suffix you have on your flask is relevant to your build and it gives you something. So if we just look at these here, I'm 3k evasion better off with these flasks. I'm 1.3 million DPS better off. And more importantly, this is quite a big difference when mapping this armor with 6.7k drop in armor from just suffixes on flasks. Now, it's obviously might be different for you because you might have different trees and different perks, and the amount you get will be different depending on your build. But equally, it could be even more. If this crit chance puts you to 100%, it's going to increase your DPS. If your evasion pushes you up to a much higher evade chance threshold, it's going to make a big difference. So we'll just touch on these at the moment. So Fizz mitigation on this is 69%. Now, this is based on like normal mapping hits, I know, but Fizz reduction is 69 and evade is 72. If we put our other flask back on, you'll notice that jump up quite a lot because the earlier stages, especially for your evasion, make a massive difference. So we can see here we've added 3 to 4% on our chance to evade, and our Fizz damage reduction in like a mapping scenario has gone up 11%. And this is all from just rolling suffixes on flasks. That's kind of all I wanted to go through for the video. The last thing to mention is flasks drop for fun in maps because of Arch Nemesis. So there is no reason to be running your campaign flasks that are like item level 45 to 60 because it limits you being able to roll the higher level mods. You may not roll them anyway, but you do not want to limit yourself of not having the chance of rolling those tier 1 suffixes and T1 prefixes. And then before I go away, the last thing I wanted to talk about on Flask is don't be afraid to have 2 Flask setups. I'm very guilty, and I still am, of just going into boss fights with my mapping Flask. You want specific prefixes if you're doing proper boss fights, where you're going to get charges back either on crit or when you get hit, or you get increased charge recovery. You want anything you can to keep your Flasks up longer if you're doing a fight where you know once your charges are up, you're still going to be in that fight. So don't be afraid to have one set of Flasks for your mapping setup and an identical set of Flasks for your bossing setup. It is going to help no end. So that's it for this really quick video. I hope it's been helpful to some people. Going to try and bring a few more hints and tips videos out before the next league. Good luck to everyone that's participating in the Mayhem event. Take care and see you next time.